The call came from a telephone booth. That detail is worth holding on to because it means the young man had to stand up in a glass box on a public street to make it. Coins ready, in the ordinary weather of an ordinary afternoon. He had a number written down. When he dialed it, asking to be admitted to a psychiatric ward, the hospital did what hospitals do. It put a psychiatrist on the line. So the interview happened there, through the receiver. However long it ran long enough. The young man reported hearing a voice, unfamiliar, not quite clear, saying as far as he could make out 3 words. The words were empty, hollow, thud. Everything else he offered was true. His parents were his own parents, his studies his own studies. The small, ordinary business of his life went across the wire exactly as it had happened. The psychiatrist listened, then formed a view. By the account the young man set down himself afterward, that view was that the caller might be in some danger from himself. That is the entire deception. 1 symptom, 3 words, spoken into a telephone by a man standing on a sidewalk who was, by every measure anyone could have applied then or since, perfectly well. There you are, friends. Whatever the day turned out to be, it is finished with you now. The rest of it can wait outside. Find whatever shape you want to be in for the next while. Nothing in this one needs you upright. Tonight is a study you have almost certainly heard of, even if the name has gone from it. 8 sane people talked their way into psychiatric hospitals across 5 states using that same small script, then behaved perfectly normally, stayed for weeks, and could not get anyone to notice them. 9 pages in a scientific journal in 1973. It is probably the most portable idea psychology has ever produced, that the professionals could not tell the sane from the insane, which went round the world inside a month. I would like to tell it properly, which means telling it the way it was received, at full strength, before anybody starts taking it apart. It was believed by serious people for good reasons. Hand you the objections first, and you will never understand why it mattered. One more thing, then we will go. The man in the phone booth is in the published paper. He is in it exactly once, in small type at the foot of a page, where his name is not really the point of the sentence it sits in. What happened to him is the part of this story I have been turning over for weeks. It is also the part I am keeping until the end, because it only means anything once you have seen everything that comes before it. So, the shape of the night. First the story as the world received it, told the way the world received it, with nothing corrected. Then the argument it started, fierce, conducted by people who were not fools on either side, never actually finished. Then the papers themselves, because in 2012 a filing cabinet was opened, and what lay inside is not quite what anyone expected. Last, the question I cannot put down. Why this version lasted, when the careful people who said it first, years earlier, more honestly, were not listened to at all. That is the whole evening. None of it will be asked of you. But first, the beginning of it, which is not a hospital at all, but a room full of bored undergraduates and a professor who could not leave a good question alone. It began, as the story goes, with students complaining about a class. The professor was David Rosenhan, who taught psychology, and who had arrived at it sideways, a degree in mathematics first, then economics, then the doctorate. His own research subject was not madness at all, it was altruism. Why people are kind, and under what conditions they stop being kind. According to a colleague who taught alongside him, he was a spellbinding lecturer. The class was abnormal psychology at Swarthmore College in the spring of 1969. His undergraduates told him the truth about it, which was that it felt abstract. Madness taught out of a textbook, with no madness anywhere in the room. They were reading descriptions of people none of them had met, written by people they would never meet either. Most teachers would have answered that with a better reading list. What Rosenhan proposed instead was a field trip with no obvious way back. Talk your way onto a psychiatric ward by reporting a single symptom, stay there, and write down what the place looks like from the inside. Extra credit, essentially. A term paper nobody could copy. You can hear how it must have sounded across a seminar table. Not sinister, not crusading, just an unusually good assignment, offered by a man his students liked. And because he was not going to send anyone through a door he had not walked through himself, he decided he would go first. There was a second room, and it matters later. Sometime after Haverford at Stanford, Rosenhan talked the idea up in front of a small graduate seminar. The study he had already survived once, described to people young enough to find it thrilling. Afterward, he invited them back to his house. His wife cooked. By every account, it was a good evening, the kind of evening a graduate student remembers for the rest of a career, when the professor's home turns out to have a dining room and a warmth to it, and an argument going on across the table. One of the people in that room was a second-year student who thought the whole thing sounded like an extraordinary opportunity. He would go in. He would stay 19 days. Hold on to him. We will not come back to him for a long while. Here is where the record has him, on the 5th of February 1969. A man giving the name David Lurie telephoned a state hospital in Pennsylvania. The woman who took the call wrote it down as she heard it, that he was finding it hard to express himself, that his speech seemed slowed, that he was very emotional. There were voices, noisy and bothersome. He had moved into a friend's house to get away from them without success. He was not sleeping. He was cold all over. Come in tomorrow, she told him. The next day his wife drove him to the hospital and signed him in, and the door closed behind him for 9 days. He came out shaken, according to the notes he kept. What had reached him was not cruelty. Nothing in his notes describes cruelty. It was the noise that never stopped, and the peculiar experience of being looked through, the way a person is looked through by staff who are busy with something else and have already decided what he is. Everything before those 9 days was preparation. Everything after them was the study. There were 8 of them in the end, counting Rosenhan. 3 women, 5 men. Set out by trade, they stop being a sample and start being a cast. A psychology graduate student in his 20s, 3 psychologists, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a painter, a housewife. Ordinary adults with jobs, families, and evenings who had each agreed to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital under a false name. They went into 12 hospitals across 5 states on both coasts of the country. Some of those hospitals were old and shabby, some were new. Several were badly understaffed. One was well funded. Only a single one of the 12 was strictly private. It was not a study of one bad institution. That was the point of spreading it so wide. The whole deception amounted to 3 words. Each of them was to say they had been hearing an unfamiliar voice of their own sex, one that was often unclear, but which, as far as they could tell, said empty, hollow, and thud. Rosenhan chose those particular words with some care, according to his own later account. They sounded existential, a life that is empty, a life that is hollow, and, more usefully, There was no such thing as existential psychosis anywhere in the psychiatric literature. No diagnosis was lying in wait for them. Beyond the voice, they falsified three things only: their name, their job, and who they worked for. Everything else went in exactly as it had happened in their real lives. Their parents were their parents. Their brothers and sisters were their own. The ordinary joys of their marriages, the ordinary frictions, the children who were doing well or badly at school. All of it true, all of it offered honestly to whoever asked. Every one of them was admitted. Picture what that took. 12 separate times in 12 separate buildings. A person who has never done this before walks up to an admissions desk, having rehearsed one sentence in the car. Somebody takes their coat and their details. A doctor they have never met sits down opposite them with a form and asks the ordinary opening questions and gets ordinary, honest answers to nearly all of them, until the one question where the answer is the voice and the three words, and then the honest answers resume. At 11 of the 12 hospitals, the admitting diagnosis was schizophrenia. At the 12th, it was manic depressive psychosis. Nobody was turned away, and nobody was asked to come back later, and no one at any point suggested that the person in front of them might simply be having an ordinary bad week. Which is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the hinge the entire famous version of this story swings on. 8 well people said one sentence about a voice. 8 well people walked through the doors of 12 separate institutions in 5 states. 12 times out of 12 the doors opened. And the moment each of them was inside, every one of them stopped. They said the voices had gone. They said they felt fine. From that first hour onward, they behaved exactly as they behaved anywhere else. Friendly, cooperative, ordinary, helpful on the ward, pleasant to the staff. The record says the charts noted it plainly enough, in the flat language charts use. Between them, over the weeks that followed, they were handed something close to 2,100 pills. They swallowed almost none. What they did instead was carry them to the lavatory, which is where they discovered the detail that tells you most about the wards they were on. Other people's medication was already in there. Not occasionally, routinely. The plumbing was the ward's real pharmacy, and everybody was quietly using it, and nobody mentioned it to anyone. Nothing about any of that changed anything at all. What the pseudo-patients did, once they were through the door, was take notes. That was the assignment. Observe the place from the inside, write down what happens, bring it out. They had worried about this part beforehand, had assumed the notebooks would have to be hidden, the writing done at night, the pages smuggled out somehow past whoever searched things. None of that proved necessary. They wrote in the day room, in the open, in front of everybody, for hours at a stretch, day after day, for weeks. Nobody asked to see the pages. Nobody in the entire study asked any of them what they were writing about. According to the paper, one nursing chart records the behavior in the same 4 words, entry after entry, as a standing feature of the patient concerned. Patient engaged in writing behavior. Not what he wrote, not whether anyone had asked. The activity itself, logged the way you would log an appetite or a sleep pattern, a symptom with a date beside it. The account has it that the closest anyone came to curiosity was a doctor who told one of the pseudo-patients, kindly, that there was no need to write things down, that if remembering was difficult, the question could simply be asked again. Think about what that doctor was doing, being reassuring, offering to carry something so a patient would not have to. It is a small act of care, and it lands on a man who is not a patient at all, and it slides straight past him without touching the thing he is actually doing, which is his job. I want to be careful here because there is a version of this story that turns the staff into villains, and the record does not support it. Rosenhan was explicit about that, and he did not have to be. The people working those wards struck him as people who genuinely cared, who were committed to what they were doing, and who were, his phrase, uncommonly intelligent. The trap had no trapper in it. That is what makes it worth an hour of anybody's evening. Consider the most quoted moment in the whole affair, which the report says lasted about 4 seconds. One of the pseudo-patients was walking the length of a corridor, back and forth, the way people do in a building with nowhere in particular to go. A nurse noticed the pacing, came over, asked kindly whether he was feeling nervous. The man said he was bored. That is the entire exchange. The nurse was being attentive, the man was answering honestly. But there was nowhere in that building for boredom to be written down as boredom. The forms did not have a line for it. Restlessness in a psychiatric hospital resolves, on paper, into agitation. And so a man with nothing to do became a man displaying a symptom, and neither of the two people standing in that corridor did anything wrong at all. The stays ran from 7 days to 52, averaging 19. 19 days is a long time, long enough to learn where the light comes in during the afternoon, which chair is the comfortable one, which of the other people on the ward wants to talk in the morning, and which would rather not be spoken to before lunch. Long enough to become a familiar face at the nurse's station, greeted by name, by the false name, but greeted. The pseudo-patients spent those weeks being pleasant, being helpful, being cooperative, and being, in the plain sense of the word, well. Their charts, read now, are almost tender in places. One records that the patient exhibited no abnormal indications, written down, filed, treated as a phase rather than as an answer. The staff were not blind. They saw a cooperative, articulate, untroubled person. They wrote exactly that. The writing changed nothing, because the diagnosis had arrived first, and everything afterward arranged itself around it. Not one of them was ever discharged as a person who had been well the whole time. There is a detail in the study that almost nobody repeats, which happens to be the best thing in it. The other patients knew. Not all of them, and not everywhere. The counts were only kept properly at 3 of the hospitals. But on those admissions wards, of the 118 people who were actually ill and actually being treated, 35 said out loud that the newcomer did not belong there. Some said it once, in passing. Some said it repeatedly, with force, the way people press a point nobody sensible would argue with. According to the paper's own record of it, what they said was that this man was not crazy, that he was a journalist perhaps, or a professor, that he was checking up on the hospital. Sit with the arithmetic for a moment. Roughly 3 in 10 of the people the institution had classified as unable to test reality against evidence tested it correctly, on the first try, about a stranger, using nothing but their own attention. The staff, credentialed and trained and paid to make exactly that judgment, went 12 for 12 the other way. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that. The study does not dwell on it, so I will. Imagine having said the true thing out loud, in a building where your saying it is itself listed among the reasons you are there. The patients who called it correctly had no way to be believed. Their accuracy was, institutionally speaking, invisible. because the one qualification that would have made anyone listen was the qualification the building had already taken away from them. I do not think that is a story about clever patients and foolish doctors. The study did not read it that way either. It is a story about what a role does to the eye. The staff met each of these people already holding a piece of paper that said what they were. The patients met them with no paper at all. Only the ordinary human business of watching somebody move around a day room for a week and forming a view. Of those two positions, the one carrying more information is not the one with the filing cabinet behind it. There is also the plain matter of time. The people on that ward had nothing else, spending it in the same few rooms, watching. Staff arrived in shifts, carrying paperwork, holding 14 other things that needed doing before the end of the day. Attention is not a credential, it is a quantity, and on those wards it was distributed almost exactly backwards. The pseudo-patients kept notes on how much contact they actually had with the doctors. The number that came out of it travelled further than anything in the paper, except the famous sentence itself. 6.8 minutes a day. That was the average time a pseudo-patient spent with a psychiatrist or a psychologist, counting everything: the corridor exchanges, the brief rounds, the moments at a doorway. Under 7 minutes out of the 24 hours. The rest of the day belonged to the ward itself, the day room, the television, the long stretches with nothing scheduled, the other patients who were doing the actual watching. 7 minutes is not negligence, it is arithmetic. 2 psychiatrists on a ward, a caseload that does not shrink, notes to write for every one of them, meetings elsewhere in the building, and a working day of a fixed length. Divide the one by the other, and 7 minutes is roughly what comes out. Nobody chose it. It simply fell out of the numbers, the way most of the things that shape a life inside an institution fall out of numbers. Remember that number. It comes back later, from a direction nobody expects, at which point it becomes the whole point of the evening. Getting out took between 7 and 52 days. Nobody had prepared for that. The arrangement was that each of them would have to talk their own way out. No rescue, no phone call from a colleague to explain the joke. Whatever it took to get released was itself the experiment, which turned out to mean, on average, 19 days of being visibly and consistently well. According to the record, though, it is the manner of leaving that has kept this study alive for 50 years. Every one of them walked out. Not one walked out as a person who had never been ill. The label 11 of the 12 carried through the door was schizophrenia in remission. Consider what that phrase does, because it does something rather elegant. It is not an apology. It does not concede a mistake or call the admission wrong, or grant that this person had been well the entire time while the hospital failed to notice. It says the illness is present and currently quiet, dormant, waiting, in the way that word implies waiting. It was also, the account holds, a genuinely uncommon thing to write in 1973. That detail sits quietly in the paper, and almost nobody notices it, which turns out to matter enormously about 2 hours from now. Hold it somewhere. 12 hospitals, none of them in contact with the others, 11 of them reaching independently for a phrase that was not in daily use. So the story the file tells, once the file closes, is a story in which nobody got anything wrong. The man arrived ill, he improved, he went home. Everything is consistent. There is no page anywhere in it where the institution turns around and says, "This person should not have been here," and it follows them out of the door. A diagnosis in remission is still a diagnosis. It is a thing that lives in a record and gets read by the next doctor and by an insurer and possibly by an employer. A sentence about you, written by someone who spent under 7 minutes a day in your company, which you now carry. That is the shape of the famous version. It landed the way few findings ever do. 8 ordinary people said one sentence that was not true. Everything else about them was exactly true, including their behavior from the first hour onward. 12 institutions took them in. Not one institution ever concluded in writing that it had been mistaken. And the only people in the entire system who worked out what was actually happening were the people whose judgment the system had formally set aside. Told that way, it is close to unanswerable, which is why what happened next matters so much, and why I want to give it the room it deserves. Because it was answered, carefully, by someone who had thought about it harder than almost anyone, and hardly anybody remembers that either. A thing worth noticing about all of it, there is no villain anywhere in the account. No cruelty, no conspiracy, no orderly with a grudge. Just a system doing precisely what it was designed to do, at speed, with too few people, holding a piece of paper it had every reason to trust, and producing, 12 times running, an answer that was wrong in the only way that mattered. But not yet. There is one more piece of the story as the world received it, the strangest thing in the whole paper. Word got around, the story goes, the way word does in a profession. One teaching hospital heard what had happened at the other 12, then said the obvious thing, that it could not happen here. Their people were better trained, their admissions were more careful. Send your actors to us, was the sense of it. We will know them when they come. So, as the paper tells the story, an arrangement was made. Over the following 3 months, 1 or more pseudo-patients would attempt to gain admission to that hospital. The staff were asked to do something very simple. Rate every single person who arrived, on a scale of 1 to 10, according to how likely it seemed that this arrival was one of the fakes. 93 days, 193 admissions, each one scored by the people receiving them. Picture the position that puts a doctor in. Every person who comes through the door for 3 months arrives carrying an extra question that has nothing to do with them. Are you real? A woman in genuine distress at 2 in the morning is now also a possible actor. The ordinary work of the place, take the history, form of you, decide what helps, has acquired a second job running underneath it, and the second job is suspicion. The results, as the report has it, come in 2 numbers. 41 of those 193 arrivals were confidently judged to be imposters by at least 1 member of staff. 23 were suspected by a psychiatrist. Rosenhan had sent nobody at all, not one. In 93 days, every person who walked into that hospital was exactly what they appeared to be, someone who had come there because something was wrong. That is the twist everybody repeats. It is also the cleverest thing in the paper because of what it does to the argument. The first half of the study appeared to show that the system could not see a well person inside it. Fine, said the profession. Tell us they are coming and we will find them. The second half answers, tell them you are coming, then watch them find you everywhere, including in 41 people who were genuinely unwell, who had come there for help. The needle swings both ways. Neither swing lands on the truth. The instrument moves according to what the person holding it has been told to expect. A far more damaging finding than the first one, if you accept it, because the first describes a failure of perception, while this one describes perception with no fixed point at all. I am telling you this the way it was told for 50 years in textbooks and lectures and the long tail of magazine pieces that followed. Hold on to it lightly. We come back to this particular experiment much later in the evening from a very different angle, where it will not look the same at all. The paper ran in the 19th of January 1973. It appeared in Science, which is not a psychiatry journal, a point worth pausing on. This was not an argument conducted inside a profession, in a venue that profession reads. It was a finding about psychiatry, published where every scientist in the country would see it, in the week they saw everything else. 9 pages. The title was a plain declarative, on being sane in insane places. It is worth knowing what the paper was not. It was not an exposé. There are no scenes of cruelty in it, no dramatic photographs, no named villain, no call for anything to be shut down. It reads, for most of its length, like what it is. A careful, rather dry piece of observational research, written by a man whose previous subject had been human kindness. The prose is level. That levelness is a great deal of why it was believed. The last line of it is the sentence that got out and never came back. It is clear, the paper concluded, that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals. Read that sentence slowly, because its construction is doing a great deal of work. Not, we did not, in these 12 hospitals in this instance. Not, this method failed on these occasions, we cannot. Present tense, no boundary, no qualifier. It reads less like a result than like a property of the world, and it is 9 words long, and a 9-word sentence in the last line of a paper in Science travels in a way that a careful one does not. It went everywhere. According to the coverage that followed, newspapers on 3 continents carried it inside the month. It was still being quoted in undergraduate textbooks 40 years later, long after the argument around it had moved on, long after the people involved had stopped speaking to one another. The response inside the profession was neither slow nor calm. On the 1st of February, 13 days after publication, the American Psychiatric Association's board met in Atlanta over what to do about it. 13 days. Anyone who has watched the professional body respond to anything will recognize that as something close to panic, however politely the record says the minutes put it. Whatever was said in that room, the men in it were not fools, and several of them had spent their working lives on wards like the ones described. Being told in the country's leading scientific journal that your professional judgment cannot perform its one essential task is not an academic disagreement. It is a thing you take home with you. Because the problem was not really the 12 hospitals. The problem was that psychiatry in 1973 was diagnosing from a manual that ran to 134 pages of largely psychoanalytic prose, with no checklists, no operational criteria, and nothing much in it that 2 doctors in 2 cities could apply to the same person and reach the same answer. The judgment of the individual psychiatrist was the instrument. That was the design, not a flaw in it. And a 9-page paper had just told every scientist in America that the instrument did not work. One man in particular read it and did not accept a word of it. Robert Spitzer was a psychiatrist in New York, already deep in the unglamorous business of trying to make diagnosis reproducible. A man who had spent years arguing that the profession's real trouble was never its judgment, but its lack of any written rule for applying that judgment. He becomes the most important person in this story who is not Rosenhan. Almost nobody outside psychiatry has heard of him at all. 2 years later, the answer arrived. It did not arrive quietly. Robert Spitzer published it in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1975 under a title he clearly enjoyed writing: On Pseudoscience in Science, Logic in Remission, and Psychiatric Diagnosis. 71 references. It is, by common agreement among people who have read both, the most thorough dismantling anyone has ever attempted of a paper in this field. Spitzer's first move is the one that changes everything, being so obvious that nobody had thought to make it. Picture a man walking into an emergency room, reporting that he is coughing blood. He is not. He has swallowed some, for reasons of his own, to see what will happen. The hospital admits him, works him up for a bleeding ulcer, finds nothing. The man then reports that the bleeding has stopped, going home in due course. Spitzer's question was simply this: what exactly has that demonstrated about internal medicine? Nothing, is the answer he expected. The doctors behaved correctly at every step. A person reporting that symptom should be admitted, because the cost of sending them away is enormous, or the cost of keeping them a few days is small. The system was not fooled. It was told a lie by a person who had gone to some trouble to tell it, then responded the way a careful system responds to a serious report. Psychiatry, he argued, had been handed exactly that, and had been graded as though it were something else. Then he went after the detail everybody remembers, which is where the argument gets genuinely interesting. Schizophrenia in remission, the famous label. The proof, in the popular telling, that no hospital would ever admit it had been wrong. Spitzer's reading is the reverse. That phrase, he pointed out, was rare, genuinely rare, almost never used in American psychiatry at that time. It does not mean we are keeping our options open. It means, specifically and technically, that this person currently has no symptoms at all. So consider what actually happened on his account. 12 hospitals, none in contact with any of the others, each independently reached past the labels they used every day and picked an uncommon one that says, "There is nothing wrong with this person now." 11 of the 12. Independently. That is not a system failing to see. That is a system seeing accurately and saying so, in the only vocabulary it had. There is a version of this where Spitzer is the profession closing ranks. I want to be careful with it, because the record does not support that either. He was not defending the manual. He thought the manual was close to worthless. His entire working life at that point was an argument that psychiatry could not go on diagnosing from prose and instinct, that until 2 doctors in 2 cities could apply one written rule to the same person and arrive at the same answer, none of it deserved to be called measurement. He agreed with Rosenhan about the disease. What he refused was the diagnosis. Rosenhan replied in the same issue. He did not concede the point, then or afterward. And here is the thing I keep turning over. Before a journal prints a paper, other specialists in the field read it and decide whether it holds. In the 50 years since Spitzer wrote, no defense of Rosenhan's logic on this particular question appears to have got through that reading. Nobody has written the paper saying Spitzer had the remission argument wrong. He won the argument. He simply lost the story. Because almost nobody has heard of him, and everybody has heard the 9 words. The rebuttal ran in a specialist journal read by specialists. The finding ran in Science, and from there into every newspaper on the continent, and then into the textbooks, where it has sat comfortably ever since, most often with no mention that a rebuttal exists at all. The book psychiatrists diagnosed from in 1973 ran to 134 pages. It was called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the reference work that lists the recognized mental illnesses and describes each one. The second edition, in force at the time, described them in prose, paragraphs, psychoanalytic language about underlying conflicts and defensive structures, elegant to read, written by people who assumed the reader had been trained the way they had been trained. What it did not contain was a rule. Nowhere in it could you find a list of the things that must be true before a person may be called schizophrenic. The judgment of the doctor in the room was the instrument. The manual's job was only to name the categories that judgment sorted into. 7 years later, the third edition appeared, 494 pages. The prose was gone. In its place stood criteria, checkable lists with numbers in them. So many symptoms from this column, present for so many months, with these specified conditions ruled out first. 2 doctors in 2 cities could now open the same book, apply the same list to the same person, and have a real chance of arriving at the same answer. Robert Spitzer, the psychiatrist who had answered Rosenhan in print, chaired the task force that wrote it. It is worth pausing on what that rebuilding actually involved, because it is the least glamorous work in this entire story. Committees, draft criteria circulated, argued over, sent back. Field trials in which 2 clinicians interviewed the same patient separately to see whether they landed in the same place. Years of it. No newspaper anywhere covered a meeting of that task force, and the manual it produced changed more lives than the paper that everybody remembers. Picture the field trials, because that is where the work actually lived. 2 clinicians, 1 patient, separate rooms. Each conducts the interview alone. Each writes down a diagnosis without seeing what the other put. Then somebody compares the 2 sheets of paper. That is a small, dull, faintly humiliating exercise to submit a profession to, over and over, for years. It is also the only way anyone was ever going to find out whether the new criteria did what the old prose could not. Spitzer put his field through it. The measure of the man is that he was willing to be told the answer. Now, how much of that rebuilding was caused by 9 pages in science? Here I have to be careful, because this is where the popular telling helps itself to more than the record supports. The account that gets repeated is clean and satisfying. A study humiliated psychiatry. Psychiatry rebuilt its manual in response. The modern diagnostic system exists because 8 people said the word thud into 12 admissions desks. The honest answer is that the direction of travel was already set. Spitzer and others had been arguing for operational criteria for years before 1973 on grounds that had nothing to do with pseudo-patients. Chiefly that studies done in one country could not be compared with studies done in another, because the 2 were not counting the same thing. What the paper supplied was not the idea, it was the pressure. It is said that in the drafting rooms someone would ask of a proposed criterion whether it would pass the Rosenhan test. I have not been able to establish who said it, or when, or whether the phrase was ever really used in that form. It may be a story the field tells about itself. But the fact that psychiatry tells that story is itself the finding. Whatever the minutes actually recorded, the profession understood the paper as the thing it had to answer. So the 2 men end up in a strange relation to one another. Rosenhan wrote the finding that everyone remembers, which Spitzer showed in a specialist journal, to be built on an argument that does not hold. And Spitzer then took the pressure that finding created and used it to build the thing psychiatry actually needed, which is still, in its 5th edition, the book the world diagnoses from. The paper was wrong in the way that mattered, and useful in a way nobody planned. Both of those are true at once. Neither cancels the other. That is roughly where the honest account has to leave it. David Rosenhan died on the 6th of February 2012 at 82. 43 years to the day since a man giving the name David Lurie was signed into a hospital in Pennsylvania by his wife. I do not think that means anything. I have found I cannot stop noticing it. Rosenhan never wrote the book. The unwritten book is the first strange thing in this part of the story, sitting there for decades before anyone thinks to pull on it. He had a contract, Doubleday in the mid-70s, for a book about the 8 of them, Odyssey into Lunacy, which is a good title. He took part of the advance, wrote something in the region of 200 pages, and then stopped. The publisher waited. Years went by. In 1989, they sued him to get the money back. There is a second thing, smaller, which only looks like anything in hindsight. When Spitzer asked him for his own hospital admission notes, redacted, names removed, just the clinical record, Rosenhan replied that he would be delighted. According to the correspondence, the notes never arrived. It had to wait, the answer went, until the book was finished. The book was never finished, so the notes never came. The papers went to Stanford, where they sat until 2017, when a journalist named Susanna Cahalan started going through them. She had a reason to care about this particular subject. She had been misdiagnosed herself, seriously, in a way that took a long time to put right. She had written about it. She came to Rosenhan as an admirer. What she was looking for at the start was the 8 of them, their names, their accounts, the human detail that never made it into 9 pages of science. She found 2. 2 out of 9, counting Rosenhan himself. One was a Stanford graduate student of his. One was the 9th pseudo-patient, the one in the footnote, who we are almost ready to talk about. The rest she could not locate. Not could not reach, not declined to comment. Could not establish that they existed. She went at it properly, the correspondence, the files, the university records, and eventually a private investigator hired specifically to find the painter, the one who had stayed 52 days, the longest admission in the study. Nothing came back. I want to be exact about what that does and does not mean, because this is the point where the story usually runs ahead of the evidence. It does not establish that those 6 people are inventions. Cahalan does not claim it. She is careful in the book, and careful about her own limits. A great deal of paper is missing. Participants used false names by design, and a person who spent 3 weeks on a psychiatric ward in 1969 under an assumed identity has every reason to have kept quiet about it for the rest of their life. What it establishes is the absence itself. 50 years on, with the man's own files open, the most influential psychiatric study of the century rests on 8 people, 6 of whom nobody has ever been able to find. Andrew Scull, a historian of psychiatry, read the same material and reached a harder verdict than that. He published it in a journal in 2023. The word he used in the title was fraud. That is his word. I am telling you he used it because he did. and because he is a serious scholar who does not use it lightly. I am not going to adopt it. Nobody has shown that those 6 do not exist. What has been shown is that nobody can find them. That is a different sentence, and the difference between the two is the only honest place to stand. Among the papers was one sheet that had never been published. The reason this story stopped being a disagreement about method, it is the admission record from Pennsylvania. February 1969. The clinical note taken when a man giving the name David Lurie was signed in by his wife. Written down at the time by the people admitting him, before any of this existed. The paper published 4 years later describes what the pseudo-patient said at admission. One symptom, an unfamiliar voice. 3 words and nothing else altered except a name, a job, an employer. The note does not say that. According to the record, the man in front of them described months of difficulty. He said he had been putting copper pots over his ears to keep out noise that would not stop. He said he was sensitive to radio signals. He said he could hear what other people were thinking, and he said, in the plainest terms the form allows, that he had thought about not being alive. None of that is one symptom. Read the list again slowly. Every item on it is a person describing a world that has become difficult to keep out. Noise that will not stop. Signals arriving uninvited. Other people's thinking, audible. Whatever else that is, it is not a man handing over a single tidy sentence and waiting to see what the professionals do with it. I want to handle this carefully and slowly, because it is the most damaging document in the whole affair, and also the easiest to overstate. Here is the hard reading, which is not unreasonable. A study whose entire design rests on the claim that the pseudo-patients presented a single, minimal, harmless symptom cannot survive its author having presented something else entirely. If the door opened because a man described being unable to keep noise out of his head for months, then the hospital that opened it did not fail. It did its job on the information it had. And the paper's central claim that a well person, indistinguishable from any other, was admitted on almost nothing, does not describe what happened in Pennsylvania. Here is the softer reading, which also deserves saying. He was one of 9. It is his own admission, his first, the one he did before anyone else had tried it, when he did not yet know what would be enough. A man who badly needs to get through a door may say more than he planned to, and the other pseudo-patients may well have presented exactly as the paper describes. We have no records from those admissions at all, in either direction. What the sheet establishes is a gap between the account and the document in the one case where both survive. That is all it establishes. It is also quite a lot. And it explains, I think, the unsent notes. Spitzer asked for that record in 1975 and was told he would have it. He never got it. I am not going to tell you why, because nobody knows why. Rosenhan left no explanation, and the reason died with him. What can be said is that the document Spitzer wanted was the document that is hardest to reconcile with the paper, and that the man who had it did not send it. There is a detail I keep returning to. It has nothing to do with the argument. Somebody wrote that note. A person on an intake desk on an ordinary Thursday, listening to a man describe copper pots and radio signals, taking it seriously, writing it down carefully enough that it could be read 57 years later and understood. They admitted him. They did what the situation asked. Everything this story became The 9 pages, the emergency meeting, the rebuilt manual, the argument still running, comes out of a room where somebody was doing their job properly. His name is Harry Lando, a psychology graduate student at the time, and it is time to give it to you. He was the second-year graduate student at that dinner, the one who heard the professor describe the study and thought it sounded like an extraordinary thing to be part of. He was the young man in the telephone booth. He went in. He stayed 19 days. What he found there was not what anybody expected. The ward was unlocked. Nobody wore a uniform, staff or patient. There were 18 beds, never all full while he was there. The day room was large and well lit, one wall lined with books and magazines, a colour television at one end. There was a separate room with a pool table, a ping-pong table, puzzles, board games. Nurses spent hours playing cards with patients or watching television beside them. The station where staff sat was usually open to patients, and the staff showed little inclination to shut themselves inside it. He kept careful count of one thing in particular, which is the number this whole evening has been walking toward. According to his own published account, in contrast to the Rosenhan figure of 6.8 minutes, average daily contact with doctoral staff was well over 1 hour. 9 times. Not a different opinion about the same hospital. A different hospital, measured the same way, by one of the same people, during the same study. His data was not in the paper. He appears in it once, in a footnote, the reason given being that his hospital was unrepresentative, which is true in the narrow sense. It was better than the others. It is also the whole of the problem, because a study whose finding is this, is what these places are like, cannot set aside the one that was not like that and still be describing the world. He read the finding in Science like everybody else. He recognized several details in it as his own experience, rendered in a way he had not written. One of them was a small private thing he had recorded, a crush he developed on a nurse, which appears in the paper transformed into a general observation about becoming a person in an impersonal environment, with nothing to indicate where it came from. What he said about that morning, long afterward, was that he felt like he kind of had the rug pulled out from under him. So in 1976, he wrote it up himself. The paper is called On Being Sane in Insane Places, a supplemental report, the title answering Rosenhan's word for word. 6 pages, 3 references. It ran in February in Professional Psychology, a journal published by the American Psychological Association itself, the discipline's own professional body. That last detail matters more than anything else in this section, so I want to be plain about it. This was not a pamphlet. It was not a letter to an editor, or a corner of the field where inconvenient things go to be ignored. It was his own discipline's house journal, under his own name, at his own address. The reprint requests to be sent to Old Botany Hall, Iowa State University, Ames, Iowa. His conclusion, in the paper, present tense, my overall impressions of the hospital are overwhelmingly positive. The powerlessness and depersonalization that Rosenhan had emphasized were, he wrote, simply absent from that setting. And then, nothing happened. No reply. No published comment. No letters that anyone has been able to find, then or since. The paper went out into the same profession that was still arguing about Rosenhan. It landed nowhere at all. 2 months later, Robert Spitzer published the 71 reference demolition we talked about earlier, the most exhaustive critique of the study ever written, by a man who had gone to the trouble of obtaining Rosenhan's own hospital record. The name Lando does not appear in it. I want to be careful here, because there is an obvious story, and the record does not support it. Nobody has shown that Spitzer knew. Nobody has shown that Rosenhan ever read the supplemental report, or was sent it, or was told it was coming. There is no letter, no note, no reason recorded anywhere. What exists is the shape of the thing, a correction, published properly, in the right place, by the right person, and a silence around it that has now lasted 50 years. Here is the part I find hardest to put down, and it is not about Rosenhan at all. 11 years before the 9 pages, a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck sat down to test something nobody in his profession much wanted tested: whether psychiatrists agreed with one another. The design was as plain as the question. 2 doctors, the same patient, separate interviews, then somebody laying the 2 write-ups side by side to see whether they matched. He was asking the plainest question available. When 2 trained people look at the same person, do they see the same thing? They did not. The agreement was poor. Poor enough that the number itself was the finding. Think about what that means for a working day. 2 competent doctors, no malice anywhere, both doing what they were trained to do, both writing down what they honestly saw, arriving at different answers about the same person. Not occasionally, often enough to be the result. That was 1962. It was carefully done. It was properly published. Its implications were exactly the implications everybody would be arguing about a decade later. Beck did not go on television about it. There was no press release, no memorable phrase, no 8 people walking into 12 buildings. There was a table of numbers in a journal saying quietly that the instrument the whole profession relied on did not give the same reading twice. Almost nothing happened. 10 years after Beck, a British psychiatrist named John Cooper led a team that went looking for the same crack from a different angle, comparing how doctors in the United States diagnosed against how doctors in the United Kingdom did. The design was clean. Show the 2 groups the same patients, the same recorded interviews, the same case material, and see where each group lands. The Americans diagnosed schizophrenia at strikingly higher rates than the British did, on the identical material. Not because American patients were different, because American psychiatrists were using the word differently without either country noticing, so that the research literature of the 2 nations had for years been comparing numbers that were never counting the same thing. That was 1972, 1 year before, and again it was read by the people who read such things. It changed the conversation inside a specialism. It travelled no further than that. So by the time Rosenhan's paper appeared, the finding underneath it was not new. It was close to a decade old, better evidenced, arrived at without deceiving anybody, published by people who did the careful thing and got the careful result. None of them are in the textbooks. None of them are in a documentary. If you have heard of any of this before tonight, it was almost certainly through the 8 people and the 3 words. Beck went on to become one of the most influential figures in the history of his field, for work that had nothing to do with this. Cooper's project is remembered by specialists as a landmark. Neither man's name means anything to the general public, and neither study is the one that any of us grew up half knowing. Which raises the question this whole evening has really been about. Being right was never the mechanism. Beck was right and reached nobody. Cooper was right and reached a specialism. Landau was right, published in his profession's own journal, and reached no one at all. What travelled was the story. 8 sane people, a locked door, a system that could not tell. It had characters. It had a deception anyone could explain to a stranger in one sentence. It had a number worth repeating, an ending that left you carrying something. The careful papers had a result. The flawed one had a story, which is the only thing that has ever moved a profession, or a country, or anyone at all. So we come back to the telephone booth, which is where we started. A young man standing in a glass box on a public street, coins ready, in the ordinary weather of an ordinary afternoon. A number written down, one symptom, 3 words, and everything else about him exactly true. Lando went in. He stayed 19 days. He came out and reported, honestly, that it had been better than anyone expected. That the doors were open, that the staff played cards with people, that a nurse had taken a patient's wife into her own home because the woman had travelled 3,000 miles with nowhere to sleep. And for that, he became Footnote 6. There are 2 ways to leave this story. I am not going to choose between them because the record does not. The first is the hard one. A study that shaped psychiatry across the Western world rests on 8 people, 6 of whom nobody has been able to find with the man's own files open. Its author's admission record does not match the account he published. The clever experiment with the phantom imposters has no hospital attached to it, no paperwork, and nothing in his papers to show it happened. The one participant whose experience contradicted the finding was cut to a line at the bottom of a page. A historian of psychiatry has read all of that and used the word fraud in the title of a paper. He is not a foolish man. The second is gentler. It is also supported. Nothing has been proven about the 6. False names were the design, not a cover story. The paper's central claim, that psychiatry in 1973 had no reliable way of telling one thing from another, was true, having been shown to be true by careful people years earlier. The profession's own answer to Rosenhan came from a man who agreed with him about the disease. The manual got rebuilt. It is better. That happened. Both of those are standing at the end of the evening. Neither one closes the door on the other. Anyone leaning toward one of them is welcome to keep it. I have gone back and forth all week. But the thing I cannot put down is not either of those. It is that the correction was there the whole time. It was not hidden. Nobody buried it. Nobody had to. It was written up by the man it happened to, under his own name, with his address printed at the top of the page for anyone who wanted to write to him, in the journal his own profession publishes. And nothing came back. Not one letter that anyone has found. The most exhaustive critique of the study ever written appeared 2 months later and did not mention him. We tell ourselves that inconvenient facts get hidden by somebody, because that at least means somebody is minding them. This is quieter than that, and worse. A field had already decided what it believed. The correction arrived, correctly addressed, and simply did not stick to anything. 6.8 minutes. Well over an hour. 2 numbers from the same study in the same year, measured by 2 people who had sat in the same dining room while it was being planned. One of them went round the world. The other one is at the foot of a page in a journal, where it has been sitting quietly since 1976, waiting for somebody to come and read it. That is where I will leave you tonight, friends. The lamp can go out whenever you like, and that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet and let yourself rest. I will be here.